was funny to them. All right, so, but when the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The Israelites sent tribute by him to King Eglon of Moab. Ehud made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes. Then he presented the tribute to King Eglon of Moab. Now Eglon was a very fat man. When Ehud had finished presenting the tribute, he sent the people who carried the tribute on their way. But he turned himself back at the sculpted stones near Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. So the king said, silence, and all his attendants went out from his presence. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his chamber and said, I have a message from God for you. So he, that's Eglon, rose from his seat. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into Eglon's belly. The hilt also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and closed the doors of the chamber behind him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the chamber were locked, they thought, he must be covering his feet in the chamber. So they waited until they were embarrassed. When he still did not open the doors of the chamber, they took the key and opened them. There was their lord lying dead on the floor. Ehud escaped while they delayed and passed beyond the sculpted stones and escaped to Seirah. So, okay. So let's take this apart a minute. All right. So this story, and again, because you're not reading it in the original biblical Hebrew, you don't understand, but it's filled with puns and double entendres. And what I've underlined for you are some of those puns and double entendres, and I'm going to explain. So the judge, Ehud, son of Gera, was a Benjaminite, meaning that he was from the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is the word in Hebrew, Ben-Yamin, literally means the son of the right. But then it says he's a left-handed man. So already there's a pun there, because he's from a tribe that's the tribe is the son of the right, but he's actually a left-handed man. Now, the interesting thing about why Benjamin was the son of the right has to do also with the south, because Yamin, which is Ben-Yamin, Yamin is not just right, it's also south. So Ben-Yamin also means the son of the south. By the way, you're all Benjaminites because you're all sons of the south, right? So you're all sons of the south. And the reason why the south is the reason for this is because ancient peoples oriented themselves with east at the top, not north. East is up. So if you think about the way that you're orienting yourself, and east is up, then right, the right side is going to be south, right? Okay, so by the way, I was telling DG about this. I actually wonder if that's the etymology of southpaw. I looked up southpaw, and nobody knows what the etymology is. And I wonder if that's why it's southpaw. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. Okay. So there's a whole other thing here, which is the thing about the left-handed and the right-handed, and I was telling DG this too. You know, my mother was left-handed. DG's left-handed, actually. Some of you may be left-handed, right? So let's hear it for the left-handed people. Now, when my mother was growing up, they actually forced her to write with her right hand. Maybe some of you have come across this, right? Because they thought you shouldn't write with your left hand. So she actually wrote with her right hand and did everything else with her left hand, because the left hand is bad. Why is the left hand thought to be bad? Because in many cultures, even until today, but also especially in antiquity, the left hand was used to wipe yourself after defecating, right? There was no toilet paper, you used your left hand to wipe yourself. So your left hand was not used, yes, your left hand was not used for other purposes, and that's why people emphasized using. So the whole thing that Ehud is a lefty and not a right-handed guy is part of the humor of the story here, and you already begin to see how the bathroom humor comes in, because, okay, so then notice that the next part I have underlined. So he makes himself a sword. He goes to see King Eglon, right? So there's also a whole other part of this, which is that the name Eglon comes from the Hebrew word egel, which means a calf. Eglon means a fatted calf. So Eglon's name, it says he was a very fat man. He actually had a name that means fatted calf. So that's part of the humor also. Okay, so Ehud requests, he's going to see King Eglon to give him the tribute that the Israelites are supposed to pay. He wants to see him in secret so that he can kill him, right? So what does he do? He says, oh, I have a message, but it's a message from God, so we have to meet in private, right? Now, how does he arm himself? So, of course, he was armed with a sword. Now, it was assumed that everybody was right-handed. So if you're right-handed, right, and you have a sword attached to you, it's going to be attached to the opposite side of your body than if you are left-handed. Exactly. So when they searched Ehud, before he goes in for his meeting with Eglon, they searched the wrong side of his body. And they didn't see the sword because it was on the other side. And that's what I have here. You see, he made for himself a sword with 2 edges, a cubit in length, and he fastened it on his right thigh under his clothes, right? Because if you were right-handed, then it would be on your left thigh. But his was on his right thigh, and when they checked him, they didn't see the sword because they didn't realize he was left-handed. Who uses your left hand, right? Okay. So then in the next couple of passages, it talks about Ehud finishes presenting the tribute, and he turns back at the sculpted stones near Gilgal. Yes?
What was the tribute?
What was the tribute? I have no idea what the tribute was. Anyway, so he turns back, he turns back near the sculpted stones at Gilgal. Gilgal, by the way, is apparently somewhere near Jericho. Gilgal is also a pun. It comes from the same word in Hebrew, glal, that means dung, as in animal dung. So there's also a pun in there. And then, if we go on, so Ehud goes to see the king. The king is sitting, it says, alone in his chamber, and he says, I have a message for you. And the king rises from his seat. Now, this is kind of weird, actually, because ordinarily, the king would not be the one to rise when he receives an audience, right? You would stand in the presence of a king and not vice versa. Here it says the king rises from his seat. The word seat in Hebrew here is kiseh, which actually does mean seat, but it also means toilet seat. It's also the word for a toilet seat. So apparently he was on the toilet, and okay, so he gets up, that's why he rises, right? So he gets up from the toilet, and then Ehud takes the sword out, right, which he's hidden, and he takes it out and he thrusts it into his belly, and it says, and the fat closes over it, right, because the king was very fat. And then it says he didn't draw the sword out of his belly, and the dirt came out. And here's another problem with the translation, because the word dirt here, haparshtana, is actually excrement. So it's the excrement comes out. Okay, so you see there's a whole lot of toilet humor in here. And then we get to the last part, right? And then what happens is Ehud then closes the doors of the vestibule and locks them. And somehow he leaves, and this has been the subject of a huge amount of speculation on the part of scholars. How does Ehud make his mysterious getaway? I have a theory about it, but I'm not going to tell you. But anyway, so he makes a mysterious getaway, and the servants, the king's servants, are standing outside the doors of the chamber. And the doors are locked, and they're standing there waiting and waiting and waiting, and it's like, so, the audience must be over. What's going on? Why haven't we heard from the king? Why hasn't he opened the doors, right? So it says after Ehud had gone, again, it doesn't say how he left, but somehow he left, the servants came. When they saw that the doors of the chamber were locked, they thought he must be covering his feet in the chamber. Now that actually is an accurate translation from the Hebrew, Mesichet et Raglam, but that's actually the biblical way to say he was defecating. That's what it means, he was defecating. So the servants did not open up the doors of the chamber to check on the king because they thought he was on the toilet, right? We already saw there's a reference to toilet in here. So they waited, and they waited and waited, so right? And they waited until they were embarrassed. And when he still didn't open the doors, they took the key and opened them, and there was the king lying dead on the floor, and Ehud, in the meantime, had made his getaway. So you see, there's a whole lot of toilet humor in here. Our Israelite ancestors thousands of years ago would have been roaring with laughter at this, with tears streaming down their face, and now you can appreciate biblical bathroom humor.
Oh, wow, these wild and crazy ancient Israelites. Who knew? Who knew? Hey, everybody, welcome back to East Chapel Hill Rotary today. I am your president, Mike Clayton. I'm glad to be back. I had to attend the funeral last week, but happy to be back with everybody. We had an electronics, a very successful electronics drive this weekend. I'd like Karen Levine to give us a quick update on what took place there. I think we showed out real well on that.
Yeah, we have 122 households participated. Many of them with their cars filled with stuff. People were really happy. Have the opportunity to get rid of it. those of you who participated, please stand up. We have no one here. We have Peggy. I know, it was raining cats and dogs, and as Liz said, we were so busy. Oh, Tom, we got it. We didn't stand up. We don't know if we could have kept up with it if it had been sunny. But the kids didn't show, and Bob Austin was also not here. Bob and Liz, they were our Sherpas. They were the ones schlepping. The rest of us helped some, but they were the real workhorses. So the actual results are in the Scuttlebutt this week. So please look at them. It was a great event.
Great job, everybody. Great job. Folks, we are coming to the end of my presidential year. I know, no one more happier than you folks, I'm sure. We're going to do something a little bit different. I think Rob Maitland might have mentioned it last week. Our last meeting will be a week later than normal. We're going to have a June 21st meeting. Our incoming president doesn't know how to read a calendar. We won't hold that against him, though. He's not here to defend himself. We're going to do something that Mark Hunt's an informal lunch, no speaker, just to get together. There's rumors of barbecue, potluck, that type thing. There'll be more information coming. We're talking about doing it at Mark Hunt's farm out close to Governor's Village, but there'll be more information coming on that. And on that note, I'm going to bring up Mr. Ted to introduce today's speaker.
All right, thank you. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to keep this brief because that's a tough act to follow. There is no, as far as I can remember from reading this, bathroom humor, ancient or otherwise, in this book. But there is a lot of really cool stuff which you'll love hearing about. Dave Fleming is like me, a guy who worked at Sports Illustrated, like me, a guy who worked at ESPN the magazine, and unlike me, he actually accomplished a lot of things there. And then he set off to go write this terrific book, which is one of 3, and he's going to tell us all about it with some Chapel Hill related anecdotes. So Dave, come on up.
Thank you. Okay, the minute I heard bathroom humor, I'm like, this is the right crowd for me. And I will tell you, I am prepared, and I'm not going to jump around too much, but there is a section in the book where the men who discussed and crafted the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence, they were all Princeton grads, and they met at a secret natural spring in Huntersville, North Carolina. One of my favorite parts of the book was rediscovering this spring after many, many attempts wandering around in the woods. After, I think it had been lost for 75 years. And when I found it, it was actually at the wellspring of American independence, the place where these men crafted the first declaration in American history. I was with a Baptist minister who had showed me where it was, because it used to be the baptismal font for the church. And I said, you know what? I'm overcome. I mean, this is where our founders were. They drank from this spring. And in the book I say, I reach my hand in, and the Baptist minister says, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And I said, I can't resist. I put my hand into it's called Freedom Spring. And I took a little sip and made a toast to the signers of the MECDEC. And in the book I said, I've either shared a drink now with the true founding fathers of our country, or I've given myself the worst case of diarrhea in the history of America. And it turns out it was a little of both. So thanks Ted, and I wanted to say thanks too to Flyleaf for being here. I really appreciate the support, and they've got books for sale. One of the best things about writing a history book in North Carolina is at every event, sometimes just in Harris Teeter, people will come up to me and say, I am a descendant of one of the signers of the MECDEC, or I know somebody who was in your book. And that's how we connected. I actually crossed paths, we sort of all crossed paths, you and your father and I, at Sports Illustrated. And Larry reached out after reading the book just out of the blue. and emailed and said, I think we may have crossed paths at Sports Illustrated. I enjoyed your book. And I was going to sort of just dismiss it as fan mail or whatever, but he compared me to David McCullough, and I said, my ego said, you need to contact this person. I don't know if anybody was here a little bit early, my daughter, who is, fingers crossed, last day of finals, should be now a junior at Chapel Hill. Just the sweetest kid in the world, and to give you an example of that, she came by with 3 of her KD friends to wish me luck today. I couldn't get them to stick around, but even by bribing them with the bread pudding. But Kate really, I wish she had stayed, because Kate really was the beginning of this quest for me. My wife and I, we moved to Charlotte kind of sight unseen about 25 years ago. And, when you move to North Carolina, and this is the place where you're going to raise your family, and instantly it's just human instinct to sort of say, I want to know more about this place. This is now my home. I love this place. I want to know more about the history. I want to know sort of what this is all about. And it was 10 years ago when I was picking up Kate at Davidson Elementary, and she was on the playground, so someone had to go get her, and I was waiting in the lobby of Davidson Elementary, and there was a flag, North Carolina flag there, next to the American flag. And this whole bizarre quest, rabbit hole that I've been down for 10 years, it began with noticing on the North Carolina flag the date, May 20th, 1775. That one question led me to 10 years later, and I don't know how many 100,000 words. All I did was ask the question, well, why would the date on our flag be 14 months before we even declared independence as a country? And immediately, as somebody who sort of lives for, it was actually my job for 24 years at ESPN and at Sports Illustrated to sort of find interesting, quirky, weird stories that hide in plain sight that most people don't know or understand, but would probably be interested in learning more about. The minute I did one Google search on May 20th, and I was hooked. Imagine standing there as somebody whose livelihood is to find interesting, crazy stories, and you Google May 20th, 1775, and you realize that Charlotte, North Carolina in general, is the cradle of American independence. That on May 20th, 1775, 27 members of the Mecklenburg community met in downtown Charlotte at the courthouse, and after being inspired by news of the bloodshed at Lexington and Concord, had decided that was it. We were going to put it in writing and declare our independence from the king. Now, there's all kinds of context and backstory to that, but suffice to say, most of them were, 25 of the 27 signers were all Scots-Irish Presbyterians. And they had moved to what was effectively the colonial frontier to get away from the tyranny of the king, which their ancestors and descendants had been suffering from for nearly more than a century. So they actually had been kicked out of the lowland Scots, moved to Ireland, kicked out of Ireland, crossed the Atlantic, kicked out of Philadelphia, and come down the Great Wagon Trail to the Carolina frontier to get away from the king. And so they were uniquely, just with their temperament, first of all, but also with the fact that they recognized long before anyone else, this is not getting better. Let's just man up, let's just declare this in writing, and let's just get to fighting. They were Scots-Irish, by the way. So, for me, though, I think a lot of people know that, and the story of the Mac Deck does sort of hide in plain sight. This is a perfect example. I had this license plate before I even knew what First and Freedom meant, and had seen the flag sort of all over the place. and all the different references, especially in Charlotte, but even as you drive up to Chapel Hill, from where I live in Davidson, you pass all these historic sites that are mentioned in the book, all these areas that are named for the men who played a key role in this declaration. But for me, what really got me, I was all in when, I think like a lot of people, you enter it very skeptically. And if you're trained as a journalist, that's what you're supposed to do. This can't be true. There are people who say it's a hoax, that it's just a folk tale, it's a funny story. And then one of the first research things I did was uncover the letters that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had written back and forth to each other about the Mecklenburg Declaration. And that's when I knew, okay, I know what I'm doing for the next 5 years. And hopefully someone will pay me to do this, because now I have to see this through. The letters are incredible. It's basically John Adams, who had been waiting for a gotcha moment with Thomas Jefferson for decades, finally had proof, and he accused Jefferson in no uncertain terms, in writing, of plagiarizing the Meckdeck, which had come out 14 months before he wrote his declaration. That led me to then again continuing down that wormhole. Right there, that was enough for me to sort of buy in and be like, okay, I need to know more about this. And again, you start to peel back the layers on this thing. And I learned that 11 US presidents have acknowledged and honored the Meckdeck. 6 of them have done so in person in Charlotte. The last one was Gerald Ford, who was there on the bicentennial of the Meckdeck, and he spoke before 100,000 people in Charlotte about this declaration. That day he was upstaged by Billy Graham, who gave a fire and brimstone speech about his descendants who had been part of the Mecklenburg Declaration. And in the book I say, well, that's awesome, because now that means we know that God's a believer in the Meckdeck too. If Billy Graham believes, then that's good enough for me. Then I thought, okay, well, fine. We've got John Adams, we've got the presidents, we've got Billy Graham, but is there anybody else? You know, any other names? And then you uncover again David McCullough, Meckdeck believer. Ken Burns, Meckdeck believer. Cokie Roberts says it's an absolute certainty. Andrew Roberts, who's a renowned British historian and the author of Napoleon and a book about the King and Churchill, again, said absolutely, no doubt. And he went a step further, I think because he's British, and he said absolutely proves that Jefferson plagiarized the Meckdeck when he wrote his own Declaration of Independence. Now I'm off on this adventure. And I had sat with the idea of this book for so long because I couldn't figure out, as a sports writer, as a magazine writer, how to do it. I didn't want to do it I couldn't do it as a straightforward history book. And so it just sat, and I obsessed over it, wondering and worrying that somebody else was going to pick it up and run with it before I could get to it. And then, thank goodness for editors, I just had a friend of mine who I'd worked with at the magazine, and he just said, write it in your own voice. Write it like you're discovering it as the reader's discovering it. And that was a light bulb moment for me. When I realized, oh, I can have fun with this. I can treat this like a travel log, like an adventure, like Indiana Jones. And for me, after that, the book really sort of took off and became really not a labor at all. It just became a joy. And I think you can read in the pages just how much fun I had, and I'm still having, sort of talking about it and helping people discover this incredible part of history. Because there are things in this book and in the Meckdeck story that there's dozens of things that will just leave you, we call it Meckdeck face. And some of you are suffering from it right now. Because you think I'm lying to you, and I'm not. Meckdeck face is that, wait a second, what? This cannot be true. And I'm here to tell you, one of the things I'm most proud of are the 25 pages of source notes. Everything in this book is deeply sourced. So we can talk proof if you want, but it's all there in the back of the book. But there are things like the South's Paul Revere, the man who was a tavern owner in Charlotte, who after they wrote and declared the MECDEC, they kind of had an oh shoot moment. Like, what do we do now? It's kind of like a hangover moment, right? The next morning after, and they were kind of like, what do we do now? And they decided to give it to Captain Jack, who had been a militia captain, and asked him to ride it all the way up to the Continental Congress, 550, 600 miles, and of course, risk his life. Because while Thomas Jefferson wrote his declaration, we were essentially already at war. The declaration, his declaration was busy work. It was paperwork that was kind of overdue. We were at risk of losing the Revolutionary War before we had even formally declared independence. And so Thomas Jefferson, and that's a whole nother talk, but also a favorite part of the book, the picture that I got from the scholars who studied Jefferson in writing the Declaration was, he just sort of sat in he moved to the outskirts of Philadelphia because he only had like 2 weeks to write the Declaration. And he was told to gather all the thoughts of the day and synthesize it into a document that we can sign so we can formally declare it. And the picture that's drawn is that he had sort of the new Constitution of Virginia's new Constitution. And he had the philosophies of John Locke, and he had the MECDEC, and he had different articles and things like that. And then he just sort of cut and paste, and that is actually a Jeffersonian scholar's words, not mine. Cut and paste from each of these and put them into his own declaration. So there's the Jefferson angle. There's the Paul Revere of the South angle, the man who risked his life to ride it up to the Continental Congress. There is an international conspiracy. Once the MECDEC was discovered by John Adams and others, there was an international conspiracy that involved me having to go to London to go through the British archives of Jeffersonian cronies trying to cover up and destroy proof of the MECDEC to protect Jefferson's reputation and his name. There is of course, we mentioned they were all Scots-Irish Presbyterians. And the religion and where they were from is part of the perfect storm that created the MECDEC in the first place. Because there was a preacher named Alexander Craighead, and same thing. His family had been kicked out of Scotland, kicked out of Ireland, kicked out of Pennsylvania, and he came to the Carolina frontier and essentially indoctrinated the entire Charlotte frontier with the idea with religious-backed rebellion. And what he preached for a decade in Charlotte was that fighting against the tyranny of the king was the highest form of obedience to our God. And again, as you understand the context of what was going on in Charlotte at the time, these guys couldn't wait. They were chomping at the bit to declare their independence and prove how much they loved their God by fighting against the tyranny of the king who had been taxing them without representation, forcing them to be married in the Anglican Church. The list of things that the king had done, especially in North Carolina, it's when you learn that and you learn the temperament of the Scots-Irish Presbyterians, it would have been way more shocking if they hadn't declared independence. If they had said, "Oh, we'll just sit back and wait and let someone else take care of this." That was not their vibe. They wanted to put it in writing and get to fighting. I think one of the last things we mentioned, Freedom Spring, the adventure to find this spring where the original Princeton grads sort of crafted all the different sections of the MECDEC. So they were ready. When news of Lexington and Concord showed up, they were ready. They knew what they wanted to say. They had practically written it already. And they were ready to go with writing up the document and voting on it and declaring it. But the Freedom Spring was a huge part of that. And one of my favorite parts of this whole process was we collected water from Freedom Spring, which still runs to this day, crystal clear. And a local brewery in Charlotte collected water from it and made a beer, a MECDEC honey ale, with drops of Freedom Spring in it. Boiled, of course. I want to assure everyone. It's a delicious beer, but it's funny that the whole thing started. I really think they met at Freedom Spring as an excuse to drink and to imbibe in. There were a couple of stills because it was a natural spring. So it was. I love the thought that the cradle of American independence was also kind of an excuse for these 6 guys to just get together and drink brandy. So I think it fits. And I think the other thing that's really important to mention, there are 2 more things that are fascinating to me and I think will interest you too. One of them is, and I will get to that in a second, besides Charlotte, the area that did the most to protect and preserve and create the MECDEC, as well as try to destroy it through misinformation, is right down the street here on campus.
No.
So there are some really interesting, and they're all in the book, and interesting deep connections between Chapel Hill, the university, and the Mecklenburg Declaration. And if I have enough time, I will run down those.
Do that.
But I think a really important thing is you can draw a direct line, and this is something we can all take pride in as people who are who live in this state. You can draw a direct line between the spirit of the MECDEC and the sort of rebellious spirit and the fighting spirit that helped create and foster in the Carolinas, and our actual independence from England. Remember, the Southern campaign of the Revolutionary War, the plan was for Cornwallis to come in through Charleston and just move west through South Carolina, decimate South Carolina, then turn north and move west back to the coast through North Carolina and decimate North Carolina. And then when he got to the coast, the plan was, after they had destroyed those 2 states, enough of the loyalists who had been sitting on the fence or been sitting back would join them, and then he would have a huge force, and he would move north, and they would squeeze from New York, and the war would be over. And the plan was working perfectly. The first 18 months of the Southern campaign, Cornwallis killed or wounded 7,000 American troops. They ransacked the 3 biggest cities that he could find. And the first place in the Southern campaign where he had to turn around and go the other direction was Charlotte. Charlotte is the first place. He ended up having to retreat 4 times from Charlotte. And the man who led that militia, they were outnumbered 15-1, but they still stood and fought Cornwallis. They had some really unique, lucky coincidences that helped them fight Cornwallis and sort of trick Cornwallis. But the man who led that, and who was inspired by the MECDEC, the man who led that militia was William Davey. William Davey is the one who fought off Cornwallis, and it started a string. It was the beginning of the end. MECDEC country and Charlotte at Trade and Tryon, that's where they fought him off. That was the beginning of the end for Cornwallis. He eventually he retreated from Charlotte, and don't feel bad if you didn't know this. I didn't know this. The reason they're called the NBA Hornets is because Cornwallis called Charlotte a damn hornet's nest of rebellion and resistance, and that's how they got that nickname. And he had been fed up, and he just said, "Forget Charlotte. We're moving out." So he moved south. And then, using the same kind of tactics that they used in Charlotte, in Kings Mountain, they scored a huge victory against Cornwallis. And now, most people know, like I was taught, Cornwallis surrendered in Yorktown. That's where the war ended. But I never knew, why was he in Yorktown? He was in Yorktown because the MECDECers and the Hornets' Nest and the North Carolinians kicked Cornwallis's butt all the way through North Carolina, and he had to retreat to Wilmington first, and then up the coast to Yorktown to basically heal his troops, to to resupply and to just reorganize. And that's why he was in Yorktown, all thanks to North and South Carolina. And originally, one of the book was going to be America, You're Welcome, from North Carolina. But we settled on Who's Your Founding Father. Now let's. How are we good on time, or how do you?
You have 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay.
Gosh, a question.
Yes, sir. And yeah, if we have questions at this point, I'd love to interact in whatever you guys have. Yeah.
Questions.
Oh, do you have a question?
I'll start.
Yeah.
So going back to Chapel Hill, let's tell us about
Yes,
Chapel
yes,
Hill.
sir.
Tried to
Yes.
hide it.
Yes.
You're saying Chapel Hill tried to hide it.
Yes. Okay. So, part of the thing.
Tell me what my question was.
Oh, he said tell me what your question was.
Oh yeah. You were like, get back to the chapel. Get back. Hey, dummy, get back. You're in Chapel Hill. Get back to the interesting part of your discussion. So, William Davies, and again, boy, talk about knowing that they were outnumbered 15-1. And I wrote this in my notes. Talk about the original service above self. The fact that they knew they were outnumbered and they still stood there to fight off Cornwallis, and it changed basically American history. But William Davie, when the part of the reason why there's still doubt about the MECDEC is the original document burned in 1800. When it burned, the man who was the secretary of the MECDEC convention on May 20th, he made a copy of an original and he sent it to William Davie for safekeeping. And he did that because he said he's the most respected, trusted, honorable man in this state, and I know that the MECDEC will be safe with him. So it's funny, when Kate, you were talking about my daughter earlier, and she's, again, she is mentioned in the book, it's dedicated to her. She was a research assistant, and she did a lot of these trips. And when we went on her tour of Chapel Hill, there are landmarks to the MECDEC all over campus. There's Davie Hall, there's Wilson Library, which we'll get to next, and there's Phillips. And poor Kate was finally like, yeah, stop it. Stop telling everyone about the MECDEC. This is my college tour. But, so I didn't ruin it too bad. She still came to Chapel Hill. Wilson Library is where all of the documents pertaining to the MECDEC are stored and kept. Including, which I think are the most fascinating, it's called the Davie copy of the MECDEC. That's stored there, although no one's allowed to see that anymore because of a controversy that we will get to. But also all the original meeting notes from May 20th, 1775 are in the Wilson Library archives. And you can hold them in your hand. And it's basically, it puts the whole day in context. It talks about how the messenger rider from the coast had come in, roared into town to tell them about Lexington and Concord. It says about how the men then were inspired and decided to declare independence. And then it lays out an outline of what each section of the MECDEC was going to say. And to people who are still doubters or people who are doubters, because we don't have the exact original copy still, it burned. I always say that those rough notes, which anybody in here can go to Wilson Library, make an appointment with the archivist, and you can see them and hold them in your hand. Those notes alone, if that was the only evidence that survived, those notes alone prove it beyond a shadow of a doubt. So we've got Wilson Library. And I will say the other thing I love about Wilson Library is the librarian it's named after is a man who, when someone, later on, there was a guy who was trying to pass off and sell a fake copy of the MECDEC. And forgive me, I forget the librarian's first name, but he was in charge of authenticating it and said, this is a fake. And when the guy threatened to beat him up, the librarian stood his ground and said, get the hell out of town. And I just love the fact that the guy who originally protected the MECDEC from a hoax that Wilson Library, named after him, is still protecting those documents to this day. So I love that. Now to the bad part. Yes, listen.
What's the controversy?
Yes.
You can't see.
The controversy, well, the controversy is that the original document burned in 1800.
But you said you can't see the copy.
Yes, thank you. Exactly. That's what I'm getting to next. So the Davy copy was the best original copy of the mech deck that was made, and it was given to Davy and kept with his papers. In 1853, a professor of mathematics named Charles Phillips, who was the son of the professor, the beloved professor who I believe Phillips Hall was named after. He was Charles Phillips was an associate professor. He was having a hard time getting a full-time gig in Carolina, et cetera, et cetera. He decided he was also part of the Carolina Historical Society, and as such had access to the Davy copy of the mech deck. Let's just say anti-Presbyterian. His dad was a huge fan of England and the crown. He considered himself English, so he was anti-Declaration of Independence. And he was anti-South, I think, because of the things that happened with the school shutting down, losing his job because of the Civil War. He decides that he's going to take the Davy copy, alter it in a way that proves his theory, and then write a paper about how the mech deck essentially was invented and just spun out of whole cloth by people in Charlotte trying to get more attention and more credit for declaring independence. Like I said, because he had access to the Davy copy, he altered it in a way that helped prove his point. And then, after publishing it was called May 1775. And it's basically, if you're a mech deck doubter or a denier, this is your rosary stone, right? That's what you base it off of. But it's based off of a falsified copy of the Davy copy of the mech deck that disappeared, strangely, right after Charles Phillips' screed about the mech deck came out. And it stayed missing for almost 60 years. And during that time, his theory on the mech deck, and I think mixed in with people's enmity toward the South for the Civil War, and people eager to I think the sentiment was, if you declare war against your own country, you lose the privilege of claiming original patriotism. And so we're all going to just use this paper, and we're going to use it as proof that the mech deck never happened. And we are in, obviously, currently, a huge era of misinformation. But the mech deck was probably the original victim of misinformation, because once that misinformation settled as fact, it's now been 125 years, and I'm still here trying to convince people that it happened.
Is this all in your book? Because my wife, her father was Charles Phillips Russell, professor here at the university, and that long line back to the 1830s. And she's got a lot of original papers and things like that, some of which she gave to the university, but she's finding more. But do you have that in your book now?
This is all in my book, and can I come over later to look through
I want to get a copy. I want to get a copy of that book.
Because I am convinced that there is a bunch of different proof that's been destroyed, and I'm convinced the mech deck is going to fall out of somebody's family Bible, or some other proof is going to fall out of. It was printed in a newspaper, and those newspapers were destroyed by Jeffersonians. But I feel like, again, somebody like your wife is going to open an old family thing, and it's going to fall out.
Well, she's already found a bunch of things already. It just blows my mind. Okay.
And I'm biased, but Charles Phillips, the man who wrote this anti-mech deck screed, in his eulogy, it was announced that his students hated him so much that they called him Old Fatty behind his back. So it's not just me. Yes.
Super quick question. There's 2 dates on the license plate. May 20th, 1775, and April 12th, 1776. What is April 12th, 1776?
April 12th is the Halifax Resolves, which is a similar declaration. Obviously...
Your next book.
Right. I need to clear that with Kate and my wife, but I think it was, again, just to put it in context, because I know part of Charles Phillips' theory was, what would these farmers and uneducated people on the Carolina frontier, what would they know or care about high concepts like freedom and independence? And he, just to show you how off he was, the men who wrote the Mectec were all Princeton scholars. So that theory doesn't hold true. Of course they were interested in high concepts, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So let's assume that the Mectec preceded the Declaration of Independence. What is the degree of overlap? How much did one borrow from the other?
Yeah, could you read the preamble?
That's a very good question, and I appreciate it. I mean, according to John Adams, according to both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's biographer, that somebody plagiarized somebody. There can't be a coincidence. There are probably more, but there are 5 main sections of the Mectec that very closely resemble the Declaration. And it was John Adams who first brought it to light, and then Jefferson's biographer was so convinced that he then started doing research because he was worried. He didn't want to falsely accuse Jefferson of plagiarism either. But the biographer says somebody plagiarized somebody. It can't be a coincidence.
Just real quick. So if I want to see the Davy copy, why can't I see it? If I want to go make an appointment.
Okay, and to me this is kind of like the movie, the cinema, because it was altered, and they believe that somebody who's a Jeffersonian or somebody who wants to back up what Charles Phillips originally wrote could take it, and if they take it and destroy it, that's one less piece of evidence.
But so I can't go down there right now.
You can see a copy of it, but you can't. I couldn't get to the original copy of the dated.
They think you might destroy it.
No, I guess yeah. I would have no reason to, but yeah. And it's weird that they would let you can hold the rough notes.
Yeah.
But not the Davy copy. I think because of the controversy behind it. Hi.
My question is, who are the signers of the original document?
It's 27 men. Originally, they had already scheduled to meet on May 20th. Because of the things that we were talking about, the context that was going on, the people were frustrated by the Stamp Act. They were beside themselves with the Marriage and Vestry Act, which had just come out, which basically said to these Presbyterians, if you're not married by an Anglican priest, your children will be born bastards and not allowed to inherit any of the land or property that. So you can imagine they were eager to fight. They were riled up. There was the regulator movement was already going on, which some people think are the first battles of the Revolutionary War. And so there was a plan to have. They asked for 2 representatives from each section of Mecklenburg County. To either be nominated or elected, and then sent to the courthouse to discuss what was going on and how they were going to react. And then imagine that scene. They're there on a Friday to discuss this, and these men the Princeton scholars have already started drafting a declaration. They're just waiting for the right moment. And then the messenger arrives in from Charleston, because news traveled down the coast first and then came inland. He comes roaring into Trade and Tryon and says, Americans have been killed and shot at and shed blood at Lexington and Concord. We're at war. And so these men again, it's a perfect storm. These men then sat down, they voted, decided to declare independence, and then got right to work crafting it. So they were all sort of militia captains or representatives in Mecklenburg County. They were, 25 of them were Scots-Irish Presbyterians. There were, I'm trying to think of most of them were, I was going to say diverse. It was not a diverse group. It was landowners, it was men, and it was Scots-Irish Presbyterians. So those are the men who made up, but it included farmers, it included guys who made alcohol, it included priests, it included lawyers, so there was, within that very narrow group, there was an economic diversity, which I thought was interesting, because again, you've got this sort of the Princeton scholar side, and then you've got these guys who are like, they just wanted to fight.
Thank you. Are there any names we would recognize from North Carolina history?
Oh, of course, yes. Let's see. I don't have a list, but I mean, it's Thomas Polk, the John Davidson, Pfeiffer, the Alexanders. I think there were four Alexanders who signed it. Let's see, Brevard, Waitstill Avery. I'll tell you a quick side note. We were talking about different people you run into. And the first time the book came out, a neighbor of ours, a good friend of ours who was a Carolina cheerleader in the late 70s, early 80s, she came racing over to our house and said, I dated a descendant of Avery's when I was at Carolina. And Avery also is the guy who almost killed Andrew Jackson in a duel near Asheville.
My wife's name Avery, they preserved the name. Yeah, boy, oh boy.
I should have interviewed I'm going to interview you for the paperback.
You need to talk with her because,
yes.
The Phillips, the original name was Postlethwaite. Both the Phillips brothers abandoned their wives and children in England. One was a Royal Marine and deserted, and then he became a math professor, ended up down here, very famous. It's an interesting family history, and of course the family is taking care to preserve the Avery name. In particular, the four Avery brothers were all lost, killed in the Civil War fighting the Confederacy, with one going back 2 more times to make sure he got killed.
Well, the Waitstill Avery was one of the Princeton scholars who met at the spring to discuss the parts of the MECDEC, and he was incredible. His also at Wilson Library, they preserved his daily diary from 1774, and you can read what he had for breakfast and the bar fight he was in on a Wednesday. It's incredible. It's the detail that has been preserved by him. And the great story is Andrew Jackson, let's see, it was the other way around. Avery used to always pull out an encyclopedic book of North Carolina law that was written by somebody called Bacon. And when he was in a trial against Andrew Jackson, Jackson replaced the book Bacon with a side of ham. So that when Waitstill went to make his big highfalutin reference to Bacon, he pulled out a ham, and then he scolded Andrew Jackson. And of course, if anybody spoke sideways to Andrew Jackson, you immediately got challenged to a duel. And so, yeah, he nearly killed him after that duel.
I think one quick question.
Yes.
I am from Kings Mountain, North Carolina. We all know in Kings Mountain that the turning point of the Revolutionary War in the South was the Battle of Kings Mountain. And you're here telling me today that you think the Battle of Charlotte was better than
Now, wait a second. No, I mean, obviously, no. Charlotte was the beginning. Kings Mountain was a true victory. Charlotte was the first time Cornwallis went backwards, but Kings Mountain, no, you're 100% right. I mean, Kings Mountain was.
You can run for governor.
And I want to point out just quickly one last thing. One of the main reasons why I think that the evidence and the proof it's irrefutable and there's a ton of it. But one of the most compelling parts of the evidence are a lot of the men who fought in Kings Mountain and in Charlotte gave eyewitness testimony of the happenings on May 20th, 1775. One of them was named Joseph Graham, General Joseph Graham, who was nearly killed that day. He was wounded 9 times by Cornwallis's troops, but survived. And I think if he was brave and honest enough to nearly die defending the country, we can probably trust his eyewitness account of the day. So, thank you.
Folks, have a great weekend. Look forward to seeing everybody here next week.